Delighted to join you. I'm really sorry that it took me a few minutes to join in, but then I was delighted to hear all of the great and fascinating work that you are doing all around the world. It's also amazing to think that that we're all sitting here around the same screen, but connecting from different parts of the world. I am sitting here in Geneva, not very far from the Human Rights Council, where I have been virtually for the last 2 weeks. And so I was fascinated to hear about some of the work that you are doing, which is also very closely connected to some of the ongoing conversations at the Human Rights Council, certainly on transnational cooperation, but also on the issue of children and family of people that were foreign fighters that went to Iraq and Syria. So just through the quick presentation that I overheard, there's plenty of links. Everett, would you like me to start, introduce myself? How do you, yep.
Just start speaking. We have circulated your CV. Say anything else that your bio, say anything else that would be helpful. And but please just dive right into the issue.
No, thank you, and I'll do that happily, considering the fact that I'm very keen to maybe speak a bit and tell you what is in my mind, which is the challenge that you that you gave me, Everett, but also to then hear back from you. So I work for the United Nations in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where I lead the thinking and the work on the areas of the rule of law and democracy, which I'd like to see and see as extremely connected, and maybe that's what some of what I would like to discuss with you. So I was thinking of very briefly speaking first on maybe protection and accountability and impunity issues. And then secondly, turn briefly as well on some of the questions that I have on democracy. So for maybe first on what we mean by the rule of law and what we mean of protection. I mean, several of you used the words protection as you were speaking. And within the human rights and humanitarian sectors, we've been using the term protection for many years to cover a vast array of different work and concerns. And one thought that is very present in my mind currently is whether we can conceive of protection outside of governance systems that are based on the rule of law. And namely, whether we can actually think of protection as being completely in abstract from the actual governance systems existing in the various countries where we operate, and also across in terms of the relationship, the international relationship. So why is that, I think, an important question? Because we are clearly in a situation where we have a massive impunity gap at time when we see a very large number of blatant violations of international law, whether they're human rights violations or abuses, or whether they are also war crimes committed in conflict. In conflict, we all know it. We have seen a huge increase in the number of war crimes being committed, war crimes covering the full spectrum of war crimes, attacks against civilians, the use of certain illegal and prohibited weapons. We have seen even things that were at the center of what is the body of international humanitarian law in terms of protection, namely hospitals, schools, being also targeted and not only destroyed, but actually targeted. So we have seen over the last now 20 years or so, and probably even longer, a huge number of crimes being committed. But what we see more recently over the last 5, 6, 7 years is in fact far less reaction against those war crimes, and really the systems that had been put in place about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, being slowly eroded, and I'll come back to that. But so we see a lot of war crimes and far less reaction to denounce them and to react when those crimes are committed. We also see a lot of terrible human rights violations and abuses. Human rights abuses being committed by non-state actors, non-state armed groups, but also other non-state actors, including companies. And I was very interested to hear Claudio Schuftman referring to the binding treaty on transnational cooperation, but also, of course, the security sectors and many different types of companies. But we also see a lot of the human rights violations committed directly by state structures, by the police, by law enforcement officials. We see an increasing number of intervention by military forces in what used to be law enforcement operations. And we see that in many countries. I mean, we see a militarization of law enforcement that mean that military that are there to really combat are used in setting where they're supposed to work on law enforcement, for instance, to monitor peaceful protest. And if militaries are equipped with heavy weapons, they're going to really respond in ways that are often disproportionate. And this leads to then the context where some of those human rights violations are also committed. None of this is new, but what I find particularly worrying is the erosion, slow, but what seems to me clear erosion of the response to these war crimes, to these violations committed by states and non-state actors. In fact, had we been speaking, let's say, 15 years ago, we could have been saying, yes, those national courts are not always very efficient in investigating those violations, in holding those responsible into account. But look, we, the international community, have been creating new mechanisms to fill the gap. And these mechanisms have been different international courts. The UN created International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, negotiated with the government of Sierra Leone to establish a special court for Sierra Leone. And then in 1998, there was the International Criminal Court being established that started its work as of 2002. And had we spoken about 20 years ago, we may have been looking at all of that with some form of optimism that we had new mechanism there to enforce the body of international law when we have the worst violations being committed. But what we see today is, again, that sort of slow but sure erosion of those international courts. Not that they're eroding themselves, but they're eroded by the lesson, the fact that the political backup has been has been progressively diminishing, and also then that's happening in parallel to national courts being under a lot of pressure from places everywhere in every continent. And I'm located in Europe, and Europe is one of those continents as well, where we see in many countries the national courts being under pressure, the separation of power being undermined. Judges are actually called the enemy of the people, even in a democracy as established as the United Kingdom. I mean, that was the front page a few years ago, indicating that the judges were the enemy of the people. And the rhetoric of many populist government has really been towards indicating that the judges are in fact, not accountable to the public, and therefore they're less accountable, and therefore they have not much business into criticizing decisions being made by government or the executive. That's true, unfortunately, in every context. I could cite many different countries, but then I will find it much more difficult to have this being recorded. So I'm just going to set the scene there, which is really that unfortunate pressure that many judges are finding themselves under, and therefore that question of the balance of power being really undermined. And all of this lead to a context in which, therefore, the capacity to react forcefully when terrible human rights violations, human rights abuses, and war crimes are committed has in fact really been diminishing tremendously. And it is within this context that I'd like to ask, can we continue speaking of protection as something distinguished from that? Can we, in fact, from a humanitarian or human rights perspective, continue asserting that we can protect without questioning the fundamental circumstances in which this protection is taking place, and whether or not it is sustainable, and whether, in fact, protection can really occur outside of governance systems that, to start with, usually should not be even causing those violations, and should at least also respond so that when those violations occur, there is a reaction, there is accountability, understood primarily as criminal accountability, but also really at setting up then systems, governance, drawing the lessons, and trying to really have a more disciplined and structured form of governance. So I see there the link between rule of law issues and frankly also democracy. And I'm going to really turn to the question of democracy, and not to be more optimistic. I'm really sorry. I mean, I'm very optimistic by nature, but this presentation and my concerns are because I am also very concerned, as I guess we are all, about what we can see as the democratic backsliding. And that democratic backsliding has again occurred in every region of the world, whether we look at democratic institutions, and then I'm coming back to the separation of power that I was mentioning earlier, but it's not only the judiciary that are being undermined in many contexts, but also the parliaments, the way elections are being carried out, organized, the rise of populism movement seeking to interfere with these elections, the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has been used, I think we can really qualify it as used in a number of contexts to push back elections, or to simply not have elections, or have elections with far less capacities for rallies to be organized and for different voices to be heard. So we have that unfortunate democratic backsliding. I'm just going to be very short, being mindful of the time. So this is problematic for where we are now, but I think this is especially challenging because of where we need our governance systems, including democratic systems, to be, to give us the capacity to face the ongoing real challenges and the looming challenges. And I'll just really will mention a few that we all know of. It's COVID, and it's those very questions that many of you have raised on the distribution of vaccines, the fairness of the distributions of vaccines, of course, around the world, but then even within each society. So far, the countries that have seen large amount of vaccines being made available have been strong democracies, and they have had systems that have enabled them to keep order around the vaccination. There are reasons to be concerned that not every country will have the same issues, and in non-democratic countries, or in countries where the governance systems are not very stable and where there is a lot of impunity, there is a real risk that those systems may not be able to ensure that the vaccinations is taking place in an orderly manner and in ways that do not provide for, first and foremost, the strongest one to have access to vaccines rather than those that need it most. So we certainly need to have governance systems to be facing COVID, even the vaccination, but especially the looming socio-economic consequences of COVID, with what it means in terms of increased poverty, increased hunger, as we know very well, and the fact that those consequences are really felt even more strongly by women in all contexts, but also are really felt by the most vulnerable in all societies as well. So how do we ensure that we have the right governance systems now to be able to provide the backbone for the response to the mid and long-term difficult consequences of COVID is a real challenge. But then also we need strong democratic governance systems to face other big challenges, including the digitalization of the world, the large impact that many big companies have on the organization of how we structure our life. We saw the power of social media in election in the US. We saw the power of social media in Australia in terms of access to information. And so we're only at the beginning of something that is likely to unfold much more in terms of questioning our capacity to organize as societies with large transnational companies that are really able to model, in fact, a lot of the thinking by millions of people. And really, when we think that that a basic influencer on an apps like TikTok that reach all of the generation of the 12 to 20, 21 years old has easily the population of Switzerland as their followers, we really see that capacity and the changes that we're going to see probably in terms of then the access to information and the capacity of government to challenge that or to regulate that. And we also need to have strong democratic governance to be able to face the real challenges, which are the climate, environmental, and food systems crises that are also looming. And so that is why Everest, when you were just asking what is in my mind, these are the pessimistic thoughts that are in my mind. And I'm very much hoping that you can all be much more optimistic and telling me why I'm wrong and why, in fact, we should be very hopeful about the capacity of our governance systems to react to all of that. Thank you.
Cecile, thank you very much for that. Fantastic. The floor is open for comments and questions.
Okay, let me jump in. Thanks so much, Cecile. Every sentence was quotable, so I was at full speed trying to write down all your points. And I have lived with even explaining to the security forces in Sudan what we mean by protection. And sorry, and it was tricky but possible. I was just in Colombia, and the media clearly over the years has been, after the peace agreement there, been so negative to the special jurisdiction, JEP, as its initials are in Spanish. And they recently came out with such a fantastic, I don't know how it's called, auto de imputación, but sort of the indictment of the leadership of the rebel movement FARC, that somehow people now, because they had badmouthed the court, when it now comes with such a strong indictment, then they seem to be finding ways of saying, well, it's really useless, nothing is going to happen, and so on. So we have a situation where actually those that should have been praising the court for what it's coming up with are also part of sort of talking it down. And the question is, how can we, because the former president Uribe has been particularly vicious in criticizing all the institutions created by the peace agreement. So now when these institutions that follow up the peace agreement are coming up with the goods, and in a way that was completely unexpected, where they in the past have been focusing on how expensive this court was and all of these issues. So now there's almost like a vacuum where people should actually be praising this court on what it is doing, but they are still sort of, the media is barely reporting on it, etc., etc. I think when we have institutions such as that, how can the human rights community support a sort of engagement of the public in support of an institution, because these three judges that are in charge of this court feel very lonely and they need some type of support. So that's one reflection. On your other points, recently I read an article on the European Court of Human Rights and how it is actually retreating in sort of not being as combative as it used to be. And then a third aspect,
Niels,
are we using, sorry?
just keep it short, please.
Yeah, the third point would be, are we using sometimes human rights too loosely? I have seen the debate in Latin America, for instance, around abortion. Although I'm very much in favor of the woman having the power to decide over her body and so on, still there doesn't seem to be empathy in the human rights community that there can be a view of life taking place from the moment of conception, and therefore permitting abortion in a very loose way actually can affect deeply people that have a certain faith. And how can we improve the type of dialogue that we have in that type of situation, rather than beating the drum and saying this is triumph for human rights? I'm raising some of these issues because we're losing the public on the way.
Thank you very much, Niels. Thank you. Keith.
Hi, Cecile, thank you very much. I too have a long list of points here. Two things. One, on the positive side, I think that there is an opportunity with e-learning, with schools then being connected to the internet, where now over time, people will see the world outside and be able to look at other things that are not strictly on that curriculum. And that being fundamentally different than just going onto Facebook and other social media. That one. My point is a question to you, if you could, to my experience focusing on in Sierra Leone is that one of the great problems has been the economy. So when the economy is very, very weak, then there is patronage, and that's well established patronage. And there's also patronage in society, and therefore nothing manages to move. And from the euphoria of the special court and the DRC 30 years ago, it's just all eroded away. And that one of the reasons for sustainability of human rights is the economy. I don't know. I'd like your views.
Thank you very much. Another one. Yes, Claudio.
Thank you. Yes, to the deteriorating situation in human rights and democracy, Cecile, absolutely on the mark there. The situation is that we keep having a hope that we may have a response and that we may do something better that we are not doing. Well, I have just had enough of top-down kind of interventions that are very well intentioned, but don't really mobilize the people from below. So what I have been doing, and we have been doing for a long time, the first thing that we need to do is a massive campaign of human rights learning. I mean, the people do not know that they have any rights, and basically not knowing that they have any rights, they are further pushed into the fatalistic outlook on life and saying, well, what can we do? The human rights learning brings a hope in terms of claim holders learning that they are not going to be begging anymore. They're going to be demanding, because their countries, most of them, have ratified these instruments, and nobody forced them to do. I mean, you and I know that a number of the countries around the world signed on just to keep up with the Joneses. They didn't even know what they were signing on. But it gives the claim holders the possibility of demanding actively, and that requires human rights learning, organization of those people who are trained, and then mobilization for them to claim, to post their claims to duty bearers at different levels, from the regional to the national, and then of course, then if we get our act together at the global, if we all in different countries are able to put together these groups of people who are demanding changes. That's the way I think is important. Can we find from the top, yes, funding and a mechanism to set up some kind of cascading training to do this human rights learning? I think this is the call of the day. Thank you.
Fantastic. Another fantastic comment. Saudamini.
Thank you, Cecile. It certainly was thought-provoking, and there's not enough time to, I'm sure, bring up all the issues you raised. But your position as a kind of global focal point on democracy for OHCHR, it's very, it's a perspective that I'm sure is very challenging because it's so comprehensive. And this perception that you spoke about, and I wrote down, as Nils mentioned, I was writing notes and taking quotes, but the idea that democracy is backsliding. And what's causing that? It's kind of chicken egg. It's backsliding, and so it's causing backsliding. It seems as if, you know, where do we get a grip? And where are the factors? It's a lack of accountability, it's populist government, it's COVID, it's economy. And then where are the pressure points, and what actually can we do? You talked about protection outside of governance, or what kind of protection we can actually mobilize, like what Claudio just said, so important, where we can apply ourselves, take action when in fact the governments themselves are either weakened or compromised by either populism or economy or COVID and so on. But my question is, if you had to maybe headline 3 pressure points or 3 factors that really require either our individual or collective attention and action, what would they be? Yeah.
Good question. Okay, that's a great question. Bill?
Everett? Okay. Everett, I think Martin had something first. Yeah, I'll
sorry,
follow him.
I missed that. Martin, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, Cecile, I'm part of a group called United Against Inhumanity, and recently we had a rather extraordinary meeting with humanitarians and human rights activists from almost every continent. And the loud call that came from them, from people in countries affected by human rights violations, was, why is so little attention being given to justice and accountability? And at a separate meeting, I heard somebody say, you know, in Syria, we spent billions on humanitarian aid, billions on weapons, millions on pointless political negotiations, and almost nothing on justice. And it seems to me that human rights and the related questions have been allowed to become the poor relation in the UN, grossly underfunded. And if other parts of the UN can ignore them, they cheerfully ignore them. How has this come to pass? And what can we say to the people that we're in touch with in various parts of the world who are demanding action on justice and accountability? And a specific question: if a donor government gives money for human rights action and in support of, let's say, bringing a case against against a perpetrator of a war crime, is that funding ODA eligible? Can they claim it as a part of their ODA contribution? Thanks.
Very good question. Another one. Bill, you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Cecile, for that very challenging and stimulating talk. And The original narrative about impunity is really sobering for, I think, for all of us. As I heard you, what I heard was that the species is facing a crisis of legitimacy, whereas one time people could be united by religion or by hopes for democratic government or by commitment to legal principles. That seems to be falling apart, and we don't know exactly how to put it back together again. This may be a process coming from globalization. But my question to you is, which of the institutions that are left are the best? I mean, should we be working with government? Should we be working with private companies? Should be working with grassroots movements in order to try to reestablish a human commitment to shared values and common humanity and reestablish legitimacy in what it is that we are? That's my question.
That's a good one. Jim.
So I really love everybody's comments here, and my question, I think, is a glass half empty or half full. So when we look back to the point that we didn't have these instruments or institutions focused on human rights, are we saying that as we have established institutions and tried to have better systems, that those systems are not meeting the expectations we had for them and have slidden back and then and have moved backwards? And then the question would be, how far back did that take us? So I'd like to give, if we can, some credit to all the things that have happened in this on a global systems basis be understood. So is the new pump we bought just not working quite as well as we want it to, or does it have a broken part, or is it in fact was all the work that we did in this area wasted? And I just think that is the interesting thing to say is you know, how do we attack that problem? And the last questions that were asked, I think, are really important. Is where could we really do something about this? And so when I think of people, I think of my friend Stephen Heinz, who's the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who's who's so concerned about the issue of democracy and the rule of law and so forth. And so the question I have is, how do we support what could be fixed, and how do we support the voices and the institutions that might have the highest leverage in that? And my focus point is always in these things, the philanthropic community and the people earn, you know, whether they deserve it or not, have extraordinary wealth in the world today. And I always worry about, are we engaging that community of donors in these really, you know, pivotal issues as much as we should? And I don't know if there's any conversations going on among those people about this subject. So knowing where, and so if Stephen were here, he would say, there's so much that could be accomplished by the speaker who mentioned a moment ago, the strengthening, the whole issue of having people understand the human rights and the rule of law to the point that they are the ones calling for it in their own societies. And the fact that if they don't know that they have those capacities, that's such a pressure point in getting all this done. So it's not just top down. It is, how do we help the general populations make an impact in this? I hope I wasn't too convoluted in what I asked.
No, thank you very much, Jim. It's a question: are we engaging the right actors, or should we engage the public in new ways? Is it broken? What do we need to do? Really key questions. Another comment or two? Comment, question? Cecile, over to you. You know, and so to me, again, just to say thank you first for just a reflection that, as I mentioned, I think in our writing and communication, the value for these discussions for me is it's a reminder always that we don't often see what's in front of us, or we don't understand it well enough, or we don't know what to do about it. So, you know, you have been, you stimulated our thinking about this. Respond to some of the questions as you feel you can.
Thank you very much. Thank you really to each of you for your thoughts, for your questions. I cannot do justice to all of your questions and comments, but maybe just a few thoughts. It is not, I think, a question of bottom up or top down. When we think of governance systems, democracy, human rights, accountability, it really has to be both. And clearly, just the bottom up approach will not work. I mean, you can't impose changes to people. And in fact, the example that that Niels, you gave on how people may feel that sometimes we impose norms on them, and we know that's counterproductive. But the reverse is also true. We cannot simply just count on then people protesting with their demands if they're not supported. And I'll take the example of what has been going on recently, whether that's Myanmar or Belarus. I mean, there are a number of places where people are rising and going to the streets and making strong demands, but unless they are also being provided support, they can't go anywhere. And if there is not strong enough support being given, including outside the country, to really push the authorities into doing the right things or stopping doing the wrong thing, then those protests ultimately cannot remain peaceful or will be simply crushed. So I think we need to have both. We need to have a lot of grassroots work, but we also need to have a stronger, more political pressure being exercised to be able to then ensure that the grassroots movement are also supported rather than being crushed. Whether we're engaging enough at all level, no, I think that there is still plenty that can be done. And Jim, I would very much like to take you up on then, whether there are foundations and spaces where we need to have also those conversations. I think it is timely to have them. And because it goes fundamentally about also where and how do we support democracy, where and how do we support, I mean, not only human rights, but basic values on working on the basis of rule of law systems that are, it's really about underpinning the social contract among people in all given societies. Maybe some of the place where we need to do more. I mean, several of you were also referring to what are the pressure points, what are the entry points, which instruments can we really use? So I think, yes, we need to be both bottom up and top down. We need to engage many actors, including companies, the grassroots workers, and the states. I think we cannot simply just give up on the state. I mean, at the end of the day, human rights are guaranteed by states and by state structure. And we cannot have a protection unless you have a state, and there can't be law enforcement unless there is a state. And COVID has reminded us that we can't even get something like vaccination programs without strong state structure. So I think we need to also remember the central role of states. And there, I mean, I'm a lawyer by training and a public international lawyer. So I think through also states as being the guarantor of those that guarantee the legal systems nationally, but also internationally. And we also need strong states that are accountable, and that means strong governments that are accountable. So it's not being strong as being just military strong. It's about being strong, but in a way where they are about providing security and safety net for their own population and guaranteeing the social contract in each of their countries. So and those states then have to really just be working on justice and accountability and being accountable to their own people. And that's when the democracy piece get into that. So it's about states being strong and accountable to their own people. Within the UN, justice and accountability and human rights. I mean, it's the famous, 3 pillars of the UN: the peace and really just the development, and then the pillar on human rights. That third pillar has not. I mean, Martin, I think it's not been very well funded, and it also possibly has been become something where when it's a bit too inconvenient to refer to norms, then we move away. And I think it's tricky because we have to be thinking of not finding that the values are something that we cannot speak of. I have seen possibly too much of the work that we've done around protection or around rule of law being caught as being building institutions. It's about training people. It's about building courts. It's about building systems. Yes, it is about that, but it's also then about the values that are on the pin. So I'll just give an example. If we build a wonderful school, but then we don't look at the education curriculum, we know that that's not going to lead to very strong education at the end of the day. We need to do the same thing around the rule of law building. So we cannot just build courtroom and train judges without looking at the actual laws that they are implementing. Could we have envisaged a lot of training going on to train the South African judiciary during the apartheid? It wouldn't have made sense, because we would have trained judges that then would have been used into implementing a systems that was using repressive laws. And there is the need to also look at that, to look not only at the infrastructure, but also at the software of what I think we need to and should do around in the justice area. So it's about raising voices. So it's really about, and sorry, Martin, you also made a very specific point on ODA. Yes, in certain contexts. So for instance, you mentioned there were several references to Syria. So in the context of Syria, part of the reaction of the UN has been to create, in the absence of any credible reaction within Syria to hold those responsible into account, and in the absence of any international mechanism, also because the Security Council has not been able to act decisively and in a unified way on the Syria files. The UN a few years ago, the General Assembly of the UN created a new mechanism, which is called the International Independent Investigative Mechanism, that collects the information regarding allegations of crimes and then compile files and give them to the judiciary. And I actually really was, I led the creation of this mechanism on the part of the UN Secretariat, and we made sure that something like that was in fact open to ODA funding. So there are some initiatives like commissions of inquiry, etc., that can benefit from that funding. Tribunals as such do not, and that's and then yes, when we look again at the question of funding, it's interesting to see how much goes into different direction. But that said, I mean, I'm also a humanitarian and have worked for many years in the humanitarian sectors, and we are so underfunded in the humanitarian sector. Prevention is so underfunded that it is, of course, a very difficult case to make, to say we need more money for accountability. But maybe it's about closing the loop. Maybe it is realizing that accountability and justice and those values are also at the heart of prevention. And unless we invest there as well, we're not going to be able to then sufficiently prevent the commission of crimes and protect people. So I think that closing that loop is important. We don't have enough money, so the difficult decisions are where to invest, but we cannot just invest in certain aspects without considering the challenging larger environment. There's just so much. There was your comments were also rich. That again, I'm not responding to everything, but maybe just a few more words on the fact that yes, keeping again the civic space. Civic space is hugely important, but we cannot simply motivate people into going and protesting and demanding for their rights, even once they will be more aware. And I really take note of the need for more human rights education, in fact, for more education in general, and the potential opportunities with e-learning education. So there is, that's where the glass is half full, absolutely. But that then, if it leads to people claiming for their rights, but being crushed when they do that without anyone standing up for them, have we really just, advanced the equation? So that's what is a bit challenging. And just as I was walking my way back, so Niels, your important point on, from Colombia to Europe, and we could discuss it much more on each one of those examples, but we need to have long-term support for those accountability. And what we've seen is not only that the public opinion and the media time span and attention span is limited. But in some of those contexts, whether that is in fact the European Court of Human Rights in Europe, or the Colombia, JEP, and the other justice initiatives in Colombia, there's almost been a deliberate undermining by some media and some quarters of the governments and groups seeking to undermine these institutions. So it's not only that people don't have a time span, but it's been also quite deliberate. But yes, public support is needed, and really victims, I can attest to that, and some of the work that Shaudamini and I have done together some years ago. I mean, the victims' demand for justice are absolutely relentless. And that's what is really challenging and which we need to keep in mind. I mean, each one of you has been interacting with people that have seen, you know, a lot of terrible things. To me, something that is very often in my mind and a strong motivation is to remember the plea of parents who've had their children disappeared, you know, that are missing, that still don't know. I mean, so many of them said it's so much more difficult to even have a missing child rather than a dead child, because at least if the child is dead, it's a terrible suffering, but you can, if ever, have some sense of closure and move on. But there's so many people who simply don't even know and will continue to sort of like, you know, just want to have that right to truth and know what has happened and be able to move on. And these are the real demands. And while in fact also societies in all their diversities need those value-based, because otherwise we leave so many people behind, but we also get into a more cyclical sense of violence because of the relentless demands of victims and communities. Sorry again, I've been taking frantic, you know, a lot of notes of what you've said, and wish we had more time to really for me to engage more with each of you. But thank you very much.
Cecile, just fantastic, just wonderful. Just one idea that crossed my mind. The Magna Carta didn't come from a top-down situation. And I wonder whether we don't need something like an HR Carta, Human Rights Carta or something like that, maybe, as we have. Maybe that's the declaration that we do have. Cecile, we always end with a very quick round the table of final comments. Orla, would you be first?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Cecile, for a fantastic presentation, and further your way of addressing the questions and remarks you have received. I appreciate very much. At the moment, we didn't get much into the COVID vaccine and so forth, but you did mention it. And here in Scandinavia, where I live, I think we have started considering receiving the COVID vaccine as a kind of a human right for our citizens. But beyond our own 25 million citizens, I'm afraid that the solidarity is suffering. And I'm very ashamed of mentioning this. And right when we are talking here, my Prime Minister is meeting in Jerusalem with the Austrian head of state and the Israeli Prime Minister in order to discuss production of the COVID vaccine without any guarantee that the Palestinians will benefit from something new production or the like. And we know that 50% of the Israeli population, they have received vaccine, and less than 2% of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank have received the same. So I feel really we have a problem here that the less privileged people on earth, they are not receiving this vaccine. And there's a lot, even in the democracies, and I think Scandinavian countries, they're pretty democratic orientated. We are not even willing at this stage to go beyond our own borders to help the less privileged. It's sad. But again, Cecile, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla. Keith?
Yeah, Cecile, thank you very much indeed. I need to process all that you've said. There are so many huge challenges in there. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Jean-Claude?
no comments.
Thank you. Jim?
So thank you very much. It's unusual that someone, even in this group, holds our attention as you have held it. And you can tell from the questions you got how attentive we were and how interested we are in this subject. So let us know how we can be helpful.
Thank you very much. Martin?
Yes, Cecile, I just echo what Jim said. I mean, I think this is so important. And if any of us can be helpful in any way, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know.
Saudamini?
Thank you. Very, it was very interesting to see how you managed to cover the large comprehensive picture and also attend to granular details where we know we have to have traction to make change. So that was particularly interesting. And my last maybe there was mention of the digital age and the double edge of the digital age and how better we can mobilize that around human rights is certainly a question that is pertaining to us all. But thank you very much. Yes, there's more to be continued.
Thank you very much. Niels?
Thank you so much, Cecile. You mentioned that to support rule of law when laws are repressive would also be problematic. And I raised with the Supreme Court in the Dominican Republic the issue that their laws continue defining persons living with mental conditions and syndromes as idiotez, enajenación y locura, which means something like idiocy, besides themselves, and crazy. So we need to change, and there are 200 million of them around the world that need better laws, and I hope we can do that. And you have a fantastic colleague, Facundo Chacon. I hope he's still working, and give him my best regards for his work as well.
Thank you very much, Niels. Claudio?
Yes, a lot of food for thought, but don't forget that the food has to be taken in, digested, assimilated, so that it generates energies for our body. So I end up asking what I ask very often in these webinars. Come Monday morning, what are we going to be doing different to give whatever little bit we can to this cause? Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you. Bill?
Thank you, Cecile. You started off your presentation with sort of mea culpa about losing optimism, but when pressed for what can be done, your inherent and innate optimism came through because you gave us so many opportunities. So thank you for that. And I recommend to Everett that he introduce a system of cards, as in football, or in the United States, we call it soccer. Green card, meaning this was a fantastic presentation. I would hold up a green card. And I'd also use a yellow card for Niels every time he shows where he is, because it is depressing for those of us in the winter. Thank you.
Thanks. Krishna?
Sorry. Thank you, Cecil. That was very inspiring and provocative as well. I learned a lot. I don't know, when it comes to human rights, it looks like every time you go, 2 steps ahead, we go 1 step backwards, or sometimes even 3 steps forward. In my last 25, 30 years of career, that's what I have seen. It's very disheartening at times, but there are lots of great examples where things have turned around too. And I think how we can learn from them in terms of building institutions, formal, informal, working with new institutions like informal media would be probably something for UN and others to consider. And that's what I'm more optimistic about. All the best.
Thank you very much. Cecile, final comment from you?
Sure. I simply want to say a very big thank you for all of your very kind words, for all of your thoughts. I just typed my email address as well in the chat now, because I mean there were just a lot of thoughts, and I also need to digest those thoughts, and would very much like to stay in touch with with you and take further some of these. I mean, there is a huge amount of work to be done, and it's it's about also then doing it together. Even if we rally all together, there is still far too much. But any meaningful change is always about collaborating and thinking together and doing together. So for all of your comments and your support, thank you very, very much, and looking forward to staying in contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all. Thanks, everybody, and to Cecile in particular. And we look forward to seeing you next week.